So welcome to this session of NAFSA Region 11 Spring Immigration Workshop. We're talking today about beating back atrophy, things we never had to do before. And so I know that there's still some folks that will be joining us that are coming into the room. Welcome as you arrive. We'll be starting in just a minute. I know that there was a little bit of a difference between whether this was blocked as a 90-minute or 60-minute session. Because of the discrepancy, we're going to go ahead and do our best to say all the important things in the first hour, but we also will have some flexibility to roll over a few extra minutes for questions that folks may have about some of the topics that are covered. And so we're going to shoot for middle ground and have it wrapped up about the 75-minute, depending on questions. But we will, for those of you who need to be out of here in an hour, we promise you won't miss a thing. And for those of you who have a few more questions, we'll stick around to make sure that your questions are answered to the best of our ability. So you have a very knowledgeable crew of people that are going to be guiding you through this topic today, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. I did want to take just a minute to go over some of the rules of the Zoom room, if you will, just ways that we can interact with each other in this environment. So we do encourage you on your screen to change your name if you like, so it says a little bit more about you. So you might want to include your pronouns or the college or university where you are. So something that'll let us know who you are as you're speaking. Please feel free to turn on your video if you'd like to interact in that way. For those of you who may be multitasking, that's okay too if you keep your video off. But if you're asking a question or you're participating in conversation, show your face. We'd love to interact with you in person. Do please keep yourself on mute, except during the question time. And we do, we're trying to replicate what would happen in a normal spring immigration workshop. So we do encourage the side talk, use that chat button freely, connect with friends, say hello, ask questions there. I will be monitoring the questions that are submitted through the chat function. We are going to hold most questions till the end of the session, but if there's a question like a redirect or something that seems to be worth asking in the middle, I can certainly make sure to bring that to the presenters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ozan to get us started today.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. My name is Ozan Sai. I'm a senior advisor at Yale OISS, and I'm also the Region 11 KISS rep. It's very nice to see all of you here. I'm actually going to let my co-presenters introduce themselves before we go further.
My name is Jody Hanolt, and I'm the director of the International Students and Scholars Office at Brandeis University.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Shea. I'm the Associate Director at Boston College.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Shiotani. I am the Director of the Tufts International Center at Tufts University.
All right, well, thank you. So throughout this presentation, you'll see these tote bubbles in every slide. And as Andy commented on it, as we started putting those bubbles as we went along, these are kind of the reflection of our total subconscious. I think that's how Andy put it. We begin with kind of thinking about, do we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, especially after these last 4.5 and 5 years of chaos, stress, and I mean, on our title, we say for our students and scholars, but also for ourselves dealing with this whole chaos and stress. As we know, there have been many attacks on OPT, STEM OPT, other things, duration of status. Our students and scholars were definitely felt unwelcome. Some of them still do, especially in places where there's still like for instance, among our Chinese students not being able to come. Travel bans, some of which still continue. increased surveillance at the port of entry, people's laptops being searched and so forth. And not to mention kind of the increased work for all of us in our inboxes, in our daily meetings, the things that we need to do. So as a prior dancer before coming to the US, I know that it's really hard to get your muscles working if you haven't really worked them for a long time. So this session is about that. All of in this climate in the past 4.5 years, and especially in the last year in the COVID environment, we've started to do a lot of things that we really didn't have to do before, and we had to kind of work our muscles again and think about our processes in novel ways and in challenging ways. We definitely did more advocacy, both at the institutional level, but also at the national level. So these are all the things that we've been thinking about as we prepared this session. Can we go to the next slide, please? So does experience matter in dealing with all this chaos and stress and working our muscles? Your presenters at the moment, between Jody, Susan, Andy, and I, have a collective 72 years in this field, plus 5 years on F1. That's me. And yes, experience definitely matters because you've seen things. You've been through prior challenges like 9/11 or introduction of CVIS or things like that. But it also matters your kind of flexibility and ability to engage with challenging situations with uncertainty. I think if nothing, we learned how to deal with uncertainty in the past year. So it's really important to try to kind of think through things analytically and come up with creative solutions. And of course, it's also really important, as we're seeing in events like this in SIW, our networks are really, really important, and we felt the need to consult our colleagues more than ever. That's why we have that heart there. We love our NAFSA colleagues. Our region, I think, is really fortunate in that sense. We have a very active, very engaging region with colleagues willing to just hop on the phone or email and help each other out through these challenging, difficult situations. So yes, experience matters, but so does thinking creatively, and so does connecting with other people in our networks. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about some specific processes that we didn't really have to do before, but we've been doing more so in the last year, such as change of status, F1 reinstatements, J1 change of category. But we'll also talk about kind of the larger pictures as well, such as our increased involvement in protocols in our schools, immigration protocols, pandemic protocols. Our offices definitely have been at the forefront of some of these decisions. There have been so many challenges with getting our students and scholars SSN, so social security procedures. Very murky questions about remote employment, on campus, off campus, inside the US, outside the US, which has tax ramifications, immigration ramifications, compensation ramifications, and some other hidden issues out there that we might not at the moment think about. So we're going to dive into these, and on that note, I pass it to Andy.
Thank you, Ozan. So as Ozan said, these are a variety of topics, advising areas, if you were, that we identified as involving skills that either we had to learn or to sort of rehabilitate. We've been accustomed for a long time now to doing immigration advising and immigration work and support work for our students and scholars in a certain way, but the last few years, and certainly the last year, has really challenged us to, again, revisit how we're doing things, learn what we may have done in a different way previously, but now needs to be done in a completely new way or in a significantly altered way. And so these are areas, again, we're going to go through them over the next few minutes. And we encourage you to think about how your institution and how your office has interacted with some of these processes and has dealt with some of these processes as they've come up for you, especially over the last year. And I would mention, that 72 years of experience, I think we need to add another 20 years because last year really counted for 5 years as far as I'm concerned. But we start with change of status. So up to now, I'm sure that you've encountered students or scholars who needed to obtain a new immigration status. And I think for quite a long time, the standard advice we would give is to go ahead and issue a document to a particular student or scholar and have them depart the United States, obtain a new visa, and then return with that new visa and obtain that new status in that fashion. It typically, while it does involve travel, and while travel is not available to everybody, it has traditionally been the faster and more efficient way of obtaining a new status. Again, whether it's a J going to an F1 or an F1 going to a J1 and so on and so forth. So with the last year, with travel restrictions, COVID related, with entry bans, with other executive order limitations, with various countries, again, experiencing quite severe conditions as far as COVID, and students and scholars just not being able to or not being willing to travel in this environment, we've had to rethink our approach to change of status applications. And at Tufts and maybe at your institutions, you've seen perhaps an uptick in the number of change of status requests that you've received. And it's a process, again, that we haven't done for quite some time or hasn't been our default method of advisement for quite some time. So we're rethinking and reviewing how we advise and support change of status students or scholars. And some of the salient issues that have arisen in this arena is completing Form I-539. So the I-539 is a complex form. It's gone through some iterations as issues around public charge and other sort of reporting requirements have either been embedded or removed from that process. But how far can you assist without falling into the unauthorized practice of law? So a student or scholar will say, I don't want to travel, I want to change my status from within the United States. You can point them to the 539, but how much assistance are you going to provide to that student or scholar? How much detail can you sort of outline for them? How far can you go in helping them to answer some of the very specific questions that are on Form I-539? Some institutions have and continue to refer students and scholars to an attorney, to an immigration attorney, but what's the best way to do that? I think go and see an immigration attorney. That is, a common sort of piece of advice. But as we know from probably personal experience, direct experience working with students and scholars, that's easier said than done. Not every immigration attorney is really intimately familiar with F&J regulations, where most of us do a lot of our work. So what's the best way to refer the student or scholar to an attorney and make sure that they follow up on that as opposed to trying to do things themselves, or whether or not that's your responsibility to even follow up on that. If you are advising around change of status, there are a number of different variations in the change of status procedure. It will depend on the person's previous status. It will depend on the status that they're seeking, when their academic program starts, when their situation begins in terms of their academic work or employment. So teasing out those timelines can be really complicated. Explaining the relationship between change of status and employment, and that can also be complicated. And then we all know about bridge applications. When are they needed? Do you advise around the bridge application in addition to the change of status application? What do you provide in terms of detail and direction? And then on our end, how do you manage CVIS records during the pendency of an I-539? What do you do if a change of status situation becomes really complicated and prolonged? Or you have situations involving dependents or students deciding to transfer to other institutions during a change of status process. And again, issues with delays in employment and study. So at Tufts, not to say that we have the perfect response or answer to this, and I think what response you develop will depend on your institution and your office culture and the views of your general counsel, perhaps, or your immediate supervisor, whether it's a vice provost or a vice president, about how much advice and support you can give around the change of status. We decided at Tufts University to provide some general guidance. So we do have a website that's dedicated to the change of status process that outlines different situations in which a change of status may be needed or when it's really not possible. What is a characteristic sort of components of an I-539 application packet. So we'll do a fair amount of work in structuring the understanding of the process, but we won't actually fill out the 539, or we won't actually, take the student's hand, make them sign the I-20 and put the I-20 in an envelope with the I-539. At times, we will extend a courtesy in the sense of we'll look at the 539 to make sure it's signed and make sure that the right fee is in there. But beyond that, we don't take too much more in terms of responsibility. But it is something that we've had to really reacquaint ourselves with as to, again, determining how much we are comfortable advising, how much we can advise, and how much we should advise. So I'm going to invite my other colleagues at this point to mention what you do around change of status and see what issues you've seen.
At Yale, I mean, we have kind of a similar, I think, dilemma. And for the most part, our practice is similar to Tufts. We provide guidance in our website. And when people contact us, we kind of walk them through the general things to expect, that it's going to take a long time, for instance, and some employment issues and so forth. But for the most part, like Tufts, we emphasize that it's a personal application. We do refer them if they wanted to work with a lawyer. So that's kind of our practice on the Yale side is similar to that. And just kind of as a point of statistics about things we didn't used to do, we used to more see change of status demands on our with our School of Management, because most of those students come from the working environment. They're already on H-1B. But until this year, we always said, you should travel instead of changing your status. But this year, for obvious reasons, for many people, that was not possible. So in previous years, our number was 0. We really didn't do any change of status applications. But this year we had 9 students in our School of Management alone who is going through a change of status, and only about half of those are done. So some of them are still pending applications. So that's where we are at Yale.
I can go ahead for BC. So we are somewhat similar to, we are somewhat similar to Yale and Tufts, and that we do tell them it's their personal application. Kind of in the style of our office, we're probably a little bit more involved, but then we're always balancing that, unlawful practice of law and making sure we're not advising too much. And I think this year especially, we've had to decide, and we hadn't done these for years for the most part either, and we had to really assess how complex the application was and whether or not we would possibly recommend they see an immigration lawyer who we knew would have specialty in students, especially. And we did have a few students who went to lawyers and had their cases denied for bridge reasons from H-1B to F-1 because they, left their job and were working we're going to school during this semester, and they could no longer, they couldn't maintain that old status, and it was just flat out denied. So, it's become really complex. So it's how to balance that, being willing to help, and at the same time, making sure they're getting expertise as well. So that's been our approach as well.
And I can add that at Brandeis, it also takes a lot of detective work. We had a student who had been admitted for our fall semester, and he had wanted to change to well, he told us that he had come into the United States as a research scholar. He actually had come in as a B1. And not only that, but the 90 days were up. And so he really had no status. And so it was really pulling teeth to get all the information, because he really just wanted that I-20 to go ahead and file a petition. And then you have to protect them in that way, or protect yourself. Just don't just issue an I-20 because they've asked you to do it. If there's no way for them to successfully file a change of status if they've already let their other status lapse. So, students are in very difficult situations, and they're wishing to try anything and file anything in order to secure status. But sometimes we have to explain to them that it isn't enough just to file something if you've already violated a different status.
So thank you, everybody, for those comments. And please put in the chat any observations or questions you may have around change of status, and as we go through other topics around those other topics as well. But I'll just summarize this particular issue area by saying, yes, I think it is a very complex process now. Not only is the I-539 a complicated form that requires really careful analysis, but as Jody mentioned, you have to do a lot of detective work, even if you're just doing general advising, to determine whether or not it's even optimal or possible, whether or not a change of status is something that you can really converse with a student about. And then again, also referring a student or a scholar to an immigration attorney. While that is our position, while we say that it is a personal application, and if you do need assistance to speak to an attorney, we too have seen one or two applications that have been denied because of either attorney unfamiliarity with the bridge process, the bridge application process, or in one case, the attorney just not agreeing with the necessity of a bridge application. So again, we now send off, general information that says, depending on your situation, you may need to bridge, or you may want to consider bridging. Talk to an immigration lawyer. Here's the reference materials on bridge petitions. So it's been a really challenging area, and internally, because of the complexity of the change of status process, we've changed internally as well, because normally if it's just a straightforward initial attendance I-20 application for a visa, maybe complicated by COVID, that generally goes through a school designated advisor. But if there is a change of status situation, then either I or the associate director co-advise on those situations, just to make sure that we're comfortable with, the balance between our advice and sending that student off to an attorney for more specialized advice. So that's change of status. And if we can move to the next slide.
So Andy, we do have two questions related to change of status. Would you prefer them now or at the end?
Sure. Why don't we go ahead and take
Okay. So one of the questions in chat is, are there ways to avoid submitting a change of status, and to what extent do you advise students to go out of the country instead of submitting a 539?
Well, I think, avoiding a change of status, it really depends on what the student or scholar's current immigration status is and what they want to do. So for example, you may have an H-4 dependent who may be eligible to study and doesn't need to change status just to study, but would be limited in employment benefits. So that is a value decision that needs to be made by the individual student in this example. So we will have that conversation with the student to sort of weigh pros and cons. But very often the student is changing status because they either cannot study and need to be in a status that allows them to study, or cannot work and needs to be in a status that allows work. So they have to change status at some point. Now, normally we advise leaving the country and avoiding the 539 process. It's just that with COVID restrictions in the United States and other countries, with just international travel and health conditions being the way they are, it's been really challenging. It still may be the better option in certain cases, but it may not be possible in others. But then you have to deal with the extended timelines of the change of status application, much less the uncertainty of the outcome, which, as you know, we can get denials on a change of status application. So it really is a give or take on individual cases. And that's my sort of answer on that.
So the second question has to do, it's mechanical, about if a change of status from F2 to F1 is approved well after the start of the semester, whether there's the DSO role as to deferring the start date. Does the new program start date have to be within 5 months, or can it be to the next available start date?
Okay, I think that's a little bit of a technical question, and we might want to defer that or have a CVIS coordinator put in their suggestions into the chat room. I myself am not managing CVIS records on a daily basis, but it is the DSO's responsibility to figure out what to do with that record. But I'll leave it to my colleagues to sort of give their suggestions and proposals in response to that question.
Thank you. So moving on to reinstatement.
So, and similar to change of status, reinstatement is also an I-539 application used for a different purpose, of course, where students are no longer in valid status of F1 status. And the normal recommendation we've generally given to students is take this get an initial attendance I-20, pay a new CVIS fee, depart the United States, and re-enter using that initial attendance I-20. Now, there are definite downsides to that. It requires travel, for one, and it does generally, in most schools, I think, interpret that as resetting the OPT clock. So if you are working with a student in their final year that wants to apply for OPT, or if they have a CPT situation coming up, that will not be an optimal situation for them because it resets the clock. But then again, reinstatements are not optimal and have not traditionally been the go-to solution for students out of status, because reinstatements require preparation of complex application, submission to USCIS, substantial documentation by the student to show that the status violation was out, due to circumstances beyond their control. That's also very difficult because very often status violations are the result of actions at the end of the day that might have been under their control. So demonstrating that they meet the qualifications for a reinstatement. And again, to what extent do they go to an attorney for assistance on this? What extent do you also advise on RFE? So reinstatement can be complicated. A student could get an RFE around this. Do you assist with advising around RFEs? How do you, what is your policy and practice around that? And then sometimes there are status situations that involve conflicts between the student and the academic unit, the university or college, and maybe even your office. What if the student's out of status because of a misstep on your part? I'm sure it doesn't happen among this audience, but it's been known to happen nationally that a DSO might make an error and a student falls out of status for that reason. And then there are high-risk reinstatements where a case, student is so out of status or has been out of status for such a long time, there are potential unlawful presence implications. There was a time when I will speak from personal experience that we did reinstatements quite frequently. And I'm not speaking about Tufts per se, but just for over the course of my experience, reinstatements were not an uncommon procedure, and the turnaround time was 3 to 4 months perhaps. Now they can be quite extensive, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But and they have the potential for denial. And again, we're seeing increased numbers of denials and certainly extremely lengthy adjudications on that. And sometimes when we tell students it's your application, they go off and they write applications that we know probably aren't in the best interest of their efforts to get reinstatements. The letters that we see sometimes submitted with a reinstatement application is TMI, too much information, or confesses to even more serious violations. We puts us in an uncomfortable spot, but yet because students cannot easily travel and regain status that way, reinstatements have become once again more common. So just as we did with change of status, we provide general guidance. I threw the link to our reinstatement webpage in the PowerPoint, and we provide general guidance. We will determine whether or not the student is eligible for an I-20 for reinstatement. That is our obligation, of course, and we will sort of outline the general timeframe. But again, the I-539, we do consider a personal application in that instance. And so again, other institutions, really quickly, what are you doing?
Sure. So at Brandeis, we don't see too many. I think this year we might see 2 in the end. There was a conduct case, and the student was separated from the institution, and then didn't want to travel because, of course, they commencement and would be interrupted, and they also weren't particularly concerned about the reinstatement being approved in time, rather just to file it to protect their ability to remain through at least May. So sometimes it's a backup choice that they have that's more preferable than leaving and abandoning whatever they've been involved in. The one thing I wanted to mention was that these cases take so long that sometimes, they'll simply abandon them. Speaking to one immigration attorney who's handling one of our reinstatement cases, and they simply haven't seen a case approved. And it's not necessarily because they've been rejected, but just because it takes too long and people's lives move on, and they find another way to achieve their goals. It can take more than a year, and so it's a case by case, and it's such a sensitive thing that we insist at Brandeis that someone speak to an immigration attorney. We're not quick to provide funds for such a thing because in certain cases, I suppose it's not a good idea to get involved with paying legal fees for your students in their reinstatement cases. But just the same, we kind of point them in that direction and obligate them to talk with a person with an immigration attorney that's qualified to help them out. Yeah. Does someone else have something they wanted to add?
There is, thank you, Andy, for answering one of the questions in chat, which was how long are reinstatements taking, and 9 months plus on a limited sample size. I don't know if anybody wants to respond further on that. Is that roughly? And then secondly, what's the difference between the online I-539 versus the hard copy, and which do you recommend?
I did have a student use the I-539 for a change of status online, and it got approved faster than all of my others, which is opposite of what I had heard. So that's just one case.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a guesswork as to which one works. I mean, I'm a traditionalist. I've always trusted the paper form, the PDF form, a little bit more than the online form, but that's based on some real growing pains with the online form that I think traumatized everybody. But I did hear of one sort of change of status done online as well that went through around normal timeframes, around 6 to 8 months. But I believe that case was also RFE'd. But Jody, you had a conversation, I believe, with an attorney that mentioned to you about reinstatement cases. If you wanted to talk about that conversation that's up on the slide.
Oh, I thought I already did.
Oh, okay. Well, then we can move on then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so, for those of you who have J programs, which I know that this isn't the whole audience, but certainly some of you do have J programs, and either for students or you also have research scholars, and you also might be receiving someone who was a research scholar or a J1 student at another institution, and now they have a different purpose that they're seeking to pursue at your institution. Or, which probably should have been included unless I put it in the next slide. I did, so I will leave that. So we've been faced with a couple of cases at Brandeis where one of the cases was that the student was a research scholar for about 1.5 years at a local institution, and then wanted to pursue a PhD. And you have to think about a lot of things when you're deciding whether travel is even possible, which for this individual is going to be complicated, where they had to go home to. And then, of course, the consulates were operating in limited capacity. And then checking to see whether or not the objective is something similar. Are they studying physics? Are they doing research in physics, but now they're coming to study a discipline that's not even linked to science in any way. Not that that happened in our case, but we really worked hard to work with the PI, 'cause it's a PhD student in this case, or the advisor, to make sure that that link existed between what they were doing as a research scholar at their previous institution where they were working, with what they're planning to do here, and somehow that the research and the PhD would expand upon whatever they had already built during their time as a research scholar. And that can sometimes hem people in, and they feel nervous about that, the students, when the student was not quite satisfied with what she was doing as a research scholar and wanted to branch out, and was afraid that if she committed to the J1 change of category, that then they'd be hemmed in and couldn't change. But in the end, the advisor was able to make it broad enough that it could work for what the person was looking to move into. But also in this case, the student was lucky that they didn't have a home residency requirement, and that there weren't any funds that we had to worry about for 212E home residency, but that could just as easily be different for another candidate. So, F1 OPT is sometimes F1, and then subsequently OPT is what they want for a couple of reasons, especially if you're at the master's level, then you get more time on STEM than you would on AT, for example. So, there's just plain old no STEM on the J1 program. So there are things to just think about. Then the student is also trying to weigh a lot of things, whether it's okay. The other thing is it's hard to sometimes interrupt an offer of funding, right? So if they're starting in September, August, and they can't defer either because the sequence of courses isn't available, or because the funding evaporates or needs to be redirected to another individual within the department. So those are some things that our student faced. And I think I wanted to invite Osan to say something about his J short-term scholar to research scholar, which also ties in with the next slide as well. But before I say that, I will say that when we were talking about beating back atrophy or even learning something new, we never believed that any of this was possible, right? That the U.S. Department of State would be so flexible and just help us, make the dreams of our students and scholars come true. We just thought it was something of an imposition for us to ask something like this. So we always sent people traveling and never even thought twice about the possibility of this change of category. And then, the State Department became one of the more compassionate arms of the U.S. government over the past few years, right? And they were trying, if they could, to help schools. And I think, LaShawn Clark was the person that helped a lot of us the most in that. So I think that's most of the things I wanted to say, but the manual and then was very useful, and the NAFSA manual, and then navigating pay.gov is not everyone's favorite thing to do. And it was some kind of strange fee, $367 or however much it was that we had to pay the government for the privilege. But in the end, it was all worth it. So Ozan, do you want to talk about your short-term scholar to research scholar?
Sure. And just to kind of reiterate the point that Jody just made, this was, I don't think, in our realm of imagination of things we could do, but it became quite dire and needed in certain situations, especially in early summer when it was really impossible for some of our scholars to find a flight back home. I, for instance, worked with a Mongolian scholar, and Mongolia had a very strict, I think there was like one flight leaving every week, and there was a very long list. So he just wasn't able to leave. And since they came in the short-term scholar category, thinking this was going to be a short visit to the US, and then they got stuck here, it was not possible to extend them using the regular ways. So last summer, actually, we did a couple of these cases. I did two, my colleagues did a couple as well, of changing category from short-term scholar to research scholar. And as Jody already talked about it, it's really important to make sure the objective remains the same, to make sure the scholars have insurance coverage, a regular appointment, support from their department. So there's actually a lot of discussion with the scholars, with the department, when we request that change from short-term to research scholar. And we had to develop a standard operating procedure for this, what documents to collect. For instance, one thing that is important is as we said, we didn't think this was possible because the way this was put, and it still is, that these requests are only approved in exceptional circumstances. I think we finally met the test of exceptional circumstances through COVID last year. But we still had to kind of try to provide as much evidence as possible from news items from the university about the unavailability of visa services, unavailability of flights, closing of libraries, etc., to kind of make the case that this is really an exceptional situation, and the university is supporting the scholar to continue to stay at Yale, and change the status. So, and again, really 3 cheers to Loshan. She's been amazing. And as long as kind of we provided all these documents to her, she actually processed these very quickly in all of my cases. And we were able to change people from short-term scholar to research scholar, in some cases to allow them to stay in the US so that they can legally be here. But in other cases, they actually, their research was severely restricted, so they were able to continue that research.
I know that there's a little, thank you, Ozan. I think there's a little back and forth about whether there's any 212E 2-year home residence considerations when a J1 change of category is done. So Jody has responded in part. I didn't know if anybody else had something to say on that.
Yeah, I think Jody already responded to that. But in addition to 212E, I should also probably mention the bar. We had to bring that issue, especially from short-term to research scholar. I mean, in most situations, this was inevitable, but we had to warn the scholars that they would be now subject to the 24-month bar. So.
Great. And then on the slide you see before you now, we have dealt with PIs who are facing research scholars who have been with us for no more than 5 years. And again, just attempting whether they're attempting to document their attempts to leave the US, also deciding on whether or not they're able to, whether or not they're eligible to continue working, or if their programs are still active. And most importantly, just making sure that they're in comfortable positions, or that the institution is doing all they can to support a research scholar who is simply stranded, waiting for their government to either help with a flight home, or go through the process that it takes to travel when there are restrictions and quarantines that people have to face. So. Next slide.
Okay, so this slide, or this topic area, could really be the theme of the year, which is the intersection between immigration and the pandemic. So international offices, I think my experience has been, and probably many of you have seen this as well, we just have to take into account a variety of pandemic-related considerations, whether it's your institution's response to the pandemic, to health guidance from CDC or other services, other agencies and organizations, and try to fashion a coherent approach, easier said than done, to a lot of immigration sponsorship processes and policies and procedures, and to the way we normally do business. So I've just anecdotally, our office has been asked, oh, well, should we run the summer program? What will be the health consequences? I'm like, well, I don't know. So the literacy that's been expected of us in terms of becoming familiar and taking into account public health considerations, campus safety considerations. There's a balancing act as to how much of that falls on us and how much of it really isn't our job, and we need to defer to appropriate authorities. So I think I will say that we don't want to overstep the boundaries of our expertise and presume that we have any answers with respect to the pandemic, with respect to what is needed for public health and safety. But at the same time, I do know that our students and scholars and members of our community, parents, if you're involved with them, want all of our offices to work together, to think cohesively and coherently and coordinate our responses, coordinate our services. So that does mean becoming more and more familiar with other parts of the university and not just relying on a traditional division of labor between, let's say, the health service, the insurance office, the housing service, and other offices that we normally just don't, we don't really get involved with on a really detailed way because, everybody has their own arena. But, the pandemic has forced us to work together in an unexpected way. So some of the things that where pandemic related concerns have come into play, obviously with domestic and international travel, how much reading are you doing about CDC, state, and other guidelines? Are you just following your institution's advice, or are you having to go out and do your own research as to how you're advising on international travel, both coming to and going outside of the United States or within the United States? Advising on domestic travel, it used to be, oh yeah, you could go to Hawaii. You don't need to worry about anything. But now, going to Hawaii means potentially spending 14 days in a hotel somewhere. So that's, stuff that has to be taken into account. Over winter break, we had to become very familiar with different types of COVID tests, as some of our Chinese students wanted to go home, and figuring out that, foreign governments had their own requirements, and students were asking us, where can we get this test? How do I get that test? And at first I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So, but that changed pretty rapidly. So again, being familiar with COVID testing, integrating public health and safety guidelines into your sponsorship decisions. So one of the things that we've had to do at Tufts is, we have departments that want to continue business as normal, hosting visitors, hosting scholars, hosting student interns. And we've had to really step back and say, okay, even though the department really wants it, even though the chair really wants it, even though it may have the support of a dean, we really have to defer to our campus health office on this, because that is something that under any circumstance, we'd be happy to move forward with you. But we're concerned about being a gatekeeper for decisions that may be appropriate or may be advantageous from an academic standpoint, but not advantageous from a campus health and safety standpoint. And then working with academic units on ensuring immigration compliance. So again, interpreting SIW guidance such as it is in terms of, to what extent we can incorporate COVID-19 emergency conditions into our immigration policies. We are also being asked to do more data collection, and some of it is kind of problematic, about students' behavior and scholar travel and all of that to help the institution monitor risks. But we may not have the best information, and some of that information is stuff that we never had to collect or never had to think about. But those are all things that we are looking at. And then reconciling normal with emergency activity. And I think a big sort of philosophical or sort of organizational question is, to what extent are these emergency conditions going to become the new normal? And how do we incorporate COVID-19 into our standard operating procedures now and into the future? Of course, it's always possible that COVID might just disappear at one point in the near future, but we're expecting a long haul. And but should we even be making that call as to what the future will bring? I mean, because we're not epidemiological experts, we don't know what summer or fall will look like. So again, lots of big questions around pandemic issues that we've just had to think about, and these are very new areas for many of us. And so wanted to, again, just throw it out to my colleagues. How have you approached the pandemic, and how has it changed your work, and where has it sort of influenced what you've had to do?
I think sitting on the fall planning meetings, now that they've started at Brandeis, it's the point where I kind of crumble inside and am so tired and don't feel like anyone wants to hear me say, we don't know what the SIVP guidance will be for fall. So I just don't say it. I don't know what to say. It's a hard thing. And when they're starting to, at Brandeis, I think, and maybe at other schools too, they're really trying to understand, to give a better sense to students, what does hybrid mean? What's the expectation on the part of the faculty? What's the expectation on the part of the student? What's in person? which day would be in person. And, you know, I keep having to rationalize, well, you know, hybrid, no matter what, was always allowed. And, you know, we don't take attendance. So this was never an issue. You know, but when they're talking about having, oh, well, you know, it's better to have X class remote anyway, they get more out of it, then I think, oh gosh, what if that's the one class that my student needs in order to, you know, to eventually comply with in-person classes. So it's been, yeah, I'm a little bit tired of waiting for SCP guidance or pretending like there is guidance that they should be listening to as they're planning for the following semester.
We certainly got involved in, I mean, I see Andrea's asking about becoming public health experts. We became curriculum experts. We became geographical experts, travel experts, like everything. So there's, I think, definitely an increased demand in our services in any possible way. Like just this week, for instance, I work with mostly undergraduates, and undergraduates, those live on campus, are not allowed to leave the campus, however that's defined, until March 1st. So it's really hard thing to, I think, police. How do you define campus and how do you control they don't leave the campus? But that's the guidance for the college. So I had to kind of negotiate and get permission for students to leave the college to go and take photos for OPT, because the OPT season is starting this week. So even like things, micromanaging things like that, that I really have no interest in doing so, but in the benefit of students who are very anxious and eager to submit their applications, was something that I had to get involved. So that's just a small example of things we are now getting involved that, you know, we never imagined we would be, or we really don't have any interest in getting involved, but we're forced to do it for the benefit of our students and scholars. And similar to what Andy was mentioning, you know, getting involved in decisions about postdoctoral appointments, intern appointments, and kind of the visa side, travel guidance, testing, arrival, housing. So, I mean, the list goes on and on, unfortunately, the things that we're getting involved these days.
Yeah, I could just add a few things that everyone kind of did plan what other people have said. It's a lot of kind of what JD was saying. I don't know, we're tired of saying, I don't know, we're waiting for SCVP guidance, where, and then I think the monitoring aspect that the university expects from us is, at least on our end, BC has been open this whole time. I think it's unrealistic that we know where everyone is at all times, when the university itself has not made a tracking procedure for especially graduate students who aren't on campus to see where they are. So they turn to us a lot of times, say, well, do you know if the student's here? I'm like, well, we have 2,000 of them. We don't know where everyone is at every, you know, time point. So, and that comes to the classes too. And what is our responsibility to monitor if a professor decides to take the hybrid class and make it all online, even though it's designated hybrid in the university calendar. So yeah, so just, you know, it's a lot of things we never thought we had to advise on, and a lot of, I don't know, which is hard. I mean, we're used to that with gray areas, but this is a lot of having to tell constituencies and students that there still isn't clarity.
And I think, Susan, you're answering one of the other questions in chat, which is, can you guess when guidance might come out for fall? You're kind of saying that as that's you know, working in that without knowing has been such a challenge this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know.
Okay, moving on.
All right, so this is a much less serious topic, but something, you know, I would have thought, well, at least this would be something that I would know and that would be easy. But it's been probably one of the most difficult and convoluted things to advise on as far as kind of practical tangible things to advise on. I think part of our reason for saying that we had 72 years of experience also was we've done this for so long, and all of a sudden, I don't even know how to advise on the Social Security number procedures. So, I think a lot of you might know this already, but I just wanted to kind of summarize the challenges that we've had and that many of you are probably going through. There's ever-changing procedures based on your office location, which office you call. And so I know for us, we have 2 geographic locations that students typically live in. So we're working with both the Cambridge office and the Boston office, and they both have different procedures. But it's to a point, the way that we tried to strategize on this is we felt like we couldn't come up with a procedure. My colleagues were calling and trying to get procedures from both offices and getting sometimes different answers. I know for a lot of you who deal with Boston was telling students to mail everything, including their passport. Like, don't ever mail your passport to the Social Security office. So it's a matter of so what we decided is we now have our kind of 3-step approach handout went from 8 steps, I believe. And one of them is you have to use a zip code locator to figure out where your Social Security office is based on where you live. If you're in Alston, it's Cambridge. If you're in Brighton, it's Boston. So that was confusing for students. And then actually having them call and ask that day what the procedure would be. There have been definitely, which a lot of you have probably seen, there have been some consistent behavior based on both of those offices, but not always. And it's hard too when the Boston office says mail your passport and we tell them don't mail your passport, and are they going to listen to us or the government? And we had a few passports that were lost for a while and luckily have been returned. But and then so what we did is have them call, and they would eventually get a call back, as hopefully most of you experienced, 2 to 3 weeks later. Cambridge would allow to fax, but then you have students like, I don't know where there's a fax machine on campus, and COVID, they won't let me in the library to fax. So then we're kind of being personal assistants and helping students to fax things when, is it safe for them to be in the office for a long time? So we were navigating that. So, a student would walk in the office and I would happen to be by the front desk, and the last thing I wanted them to say was I got an on-campus job, which is normally I'm so excited for, that's a good thing. So I think there's also a lot of stress on the part of, faculty who have moved here and need to get Social Security numbers and managing that stress. They need to pay rent, so students as well. In the RMV also, if a student wants to get a license and they have not, if they don't have a Social Security number, they do have to go through the same denial procedure. So they have to go through all that with the Social Security office. It's no longer like, oh, stop into Boston and then go over to the RMV. It's now, they have to actually apply for the denial, and on their SS5 form, write, I just need a denial letter, literally write that on top of their application. So procedures have become pretty crazy, as well as, some schools we've heard, have had some special procedures with Social Security offices. We haven't been able to do that on our end, but it would have been nice just to be able to get a clear procedure to tell students, and that hasn't been the case. So that's something that would have been just really clear and easy, and has taken a lot more brain power to do, even if you've been doing this for a while. We also had our human resources department also had different SSN procedures in terms of who was allowed to work with a receipt because everything was taking so long, and who would actually need to wait for the Social Security number. And so if someone had an on-campus job, they had to wait for the SSN, whereas if someone had an assistantship, or scholars that were teaching, they could get paid with the receipt. I know there are tax treaties involved and things around that, but so there was even that to keep track of, as well as so there's the Social Security office procedures that were ever changing, the institutional policies that I think some of us might have been working through, and then there's the equity issues that I know I think departments were getting almost getting frustrated that they didn't want to hire an international student or scholar, and that is problematic in and of itself as well. So that's been our experience and what we found the procedures would be. There was also the students, students talk, and my friend. And so my friend got a letter faster at Cambridge. So can I use their address to get the, get the SSN? And a lot of times the Social Security office in Cambridge started figuring that out because they seem to be more amenable to helping the students or have the bandwidth to do that, or the staff. So that was another thing we were dealing with students also having to, trying to use other addresses to go to a different office. And navigating that. So I don't know if any of my colleagues have something to chime in that we're different, or I know Waltham has been one of the offices too that might have some advice.
Sure. The Waltham office has just gone through the gamut of what they require. They were asking students to mail passports at the middle part of the summer to the end of the summer. They lost one or two. So that wasn't great. Then all of a sudden they most recently, I guess they were, or maybe not, but as the semester went on, they were accepting walk-ins, but we only found out through one student that happened to say, oh yeah, that's how I did it. The instructions that we started to share with new students for SSN applications were written by one of our guinea pigs that came early and needed her SSN early, or she was already one of our students. I think that's what happened, and this was her first on campus job. So we just interviewed her, like, I don't know, like Dateline, I'm not sure, and just got all the information about how she did it. And then she was so good about it. And she was on one of our fall planning committees too. And, she just wanted to tell us everything that, that she experienced. And that was true for about 6 weeks. And then it wasn't true anymore. I will say that the issue that, I'd been butting heads with our payroll officer and student employment about when students can start working on campus. Do they need their SSN for a few years? And this was the year that it finally pushed it over the finish line, and we were able to get a better procedure so that our students were not required to wait until they had their SSN before they started working. And that was partly because I was able to just really highlight what a big mess it would be if the SSAs are closed and the students can't get their SSNs, and we have to provide opportunities for employment because it's part of their financial aid package in some cases. So I guess I can be a little bit thankful for the disruption in the SSA services, because it did ultimately push over the finish line, something I've been wanting to do at Brandeis for a while. So that's what I'll say.
Great, thank you, Jody. Anyone else want to chime in?
The SSA offices in New Haven is still closed, so it's been challenging. We've been trying to reach out to the local office and try to help our students to the best of our ability. But I think one thing I will add, in addition to the kind of availability of services, we're of course dealing with students being outside the US and not being able to apply for SSN at all, even if they're eligible for it. Questions about tax filing, etc. So again, I think another case of, one thing leads to another. So we find ourselves about finding to advise students navigate this difficulty of not being able to get an SSN. Fortunately, at Yale, there's already a university policy that students can start working and get paid without an SSN, but they will eventually need one for tax purposes and for other reasons. So that's one fortunate thing on our end. But yeah, we're seeing ourselves dealing with a lot of issues when the services are not available.
Right, exactly. And I think we're managing a lot of expectations. Even this is just an issue that highlights that, a lot of expectations of students and departments, and them thinking we can fix this issue when it's really, we're helping to advocate for our students, but it's also a matter of, somewhat out of our control, but still being supportive. So, and Ozan, I think, I guess, Andrea, if you want to go to the next slide. You segued right into what I was going to talk about next, on kind of the bigger level that we now, even more complicated, is the fact that students and scholars can basically work anywhere. And this, a lot of us, especially more traditional universities, haven't had a lot of online classes, and suddenly we have professors teaching all over, students doing research all over, and wanting to do their assistantships that would normally be here, or teach their classes that would normally be here. They're suddenly in another state or in another country in a lot of cases. So that's something that's almost completely new for a lot of us. And at the same time, we're also, dealing with unclear guidance and the kind of the intersection between immigration policies. I think Andrew had mentioned international, institutional policies and interpretations, tax and I-9 compliance. So there's a lot there are a lot of players involved and complicated and unclear often, or muddy, as someone said, things that we're working through to help the students. So I'm going to go through student issues first to kind of go through what we've been working through. BC is actually, from an institutional standpoint, BC is paying anyone abroad right now as long as they have a social security number, a bank account, an I-94 record, even if they've left, so that's strange, and a valid immigration form. So students are being paid right now, and I don't completely understand the tax implications, but they're being paid, for status they don't exactly have because they're not here. But the government in COVID SAVP guidance has said that in a lot of cases we can leave them active even though they're abroad. So that's put the human resources in that kind of situation and us when we're advising. And also from an institutional standpoint, what BC has said is initial students abroad can't be paid based on what Ozan was just saying with social security numbers, so they don't have one yet in most cases. The assistantships they're saying can be paid from abroad, and the I-9 is actually done through human resources as well as faculty and scholars. But on-campus work is treated a lot differently here. So our I-9 is done by student services. So student services won't I-9 remotely. So regular on-campus jobs, they have to be here if they need to be I-9'd. So there's a lot of discrepancy in terms of even within our institution as to who can work. So some students on campus jobs are working abroad because they have been I-9'd already, but student services doesn't think they should be. So it's on our end, it's like, what, we can't remember what's happening. We've decided to make a chart. So, and then also, like I said, all the tax implications we can't even begin to understand that's on human resources to figure out, and we're kind of the messengers again. And that message is being sent from numerous places to our departments. You think of someone who, the German department, for example, might have a TA. We had the situation, a TA who is a grad student, but she's in an on-campus job as a facilitator of discussion, language discussion. She can't work without the social security number. But then, and then they have a lot of them that are abroad, and then they also have students that are TAs and assistantship. So the department administrators are trying to figure out what's going on, and it's been hard, and they look to our office. And then as far as that's coming up, so BC said we pay anyone abroad if they have all the things I mentioned, but then becomes the SAVP guidance for F1 students that we're working through. And those that are here in March of 2020, it's fairly clear that they can maintain their status abroad. So for us, human resources is saying they can get paid. Except for transfers. Transfers became even more tricky. What if you have a transfer that never made an entrance into the US? They're considered continuing students, but they're really initial in the SIVA system. So then we have some transfers that never made it back into the US, but they have a teaching assistantship and they want to be able to teach. So those were unclear. And then what about the new students who were not here in March 2020 and came into the US? And now and decided to go back home? Did you leave, the guidance is so unclear. Did you leave the students active and keep letting them do their assistantship, or did you decide you had to terminate them because they couldn't maintain their status? I think a lot of institutions really struggled with that, and I know we did, and eventually decided to leave the students active for the few that we had who came in the fall but stayed home in the spring. But that's another thing where the lack of guidance, as Jody was saying, and we had half confirmation of, okay, you can just use the fall, but that left a lot of questions in some case, and that affected whether or not they could work abroad and get paid. And again, the issues with the transfers abroad. So we had to tell a student who never made it into the US, who transferred from another institution, that we thought she could continue working because they had I-9'd her, and eventually she couldn't get back for the semester either. So since we couldn't reactivate her record and that's unclear, we had to tell the department she couldn't get paid. So there's a lot of trying to figure out with all these different players as to who is really in status and who can get paid and who can work without an SSN and who can work with one. And it's a lot to manage and a lot to communicate to the different constituencies and departments on campus. So that's the students. I wanted Jody to chime in about scholars in particular for J1s and H1s, how Brandeis has been working through that.
Sure. So you'll see in the bullet below that the official communication that came from the payroll office to definitely to departments that were hiring students was that they couldn't work if they were not within US borders. And that for the most part has been true. It's been true also for from employees, but I think that it's been more in theory than in practice, right? So there may have been a case where someone couldn't quite enter the US in H-1B status in the fall as a faculty member, and they still had to teach their courses and do their work. So they've been set up as a contractor, and that's how Brandeis decided to do it. They never had another presence in the United States before. And so I would say that I think my sense is that things might be a little more flexible, but on a case-by-case basis for individuals that are not in the US and who are not students. My feeling is that there's probably also some gray area where students or their supervisors may not have fully disclosed where they are located, because that's the world, right? That's human nature. So I don't think it's perfect. I think it's stopped new hires in particular, new student hires, and then new scholar hires. They, except for the one that I told you was a contractor. If you can't get a J1 in, they can't start anyway. So so that's what I would say about the scholar side of things. So, and we've just seen a dramatic drop as so many of the schools with formerly vibrant J1 programs, right? We just can't get anyone started. So, that's been unfortunate because of all that the J1s bring to all of the departments that they join each year and the ways that they contribute to our institution. It's hopefully in the coming year, things will get a little bit better.
Great, thank you. And I'll just invite anyone else on my panel to chime in.
Sure. I mean, I think, Susan, you touched upon many of the main issues here. Basically, we've tried to draw lines in the sand when there was no lines that existed, or it was really murky. But kind of like similar to your conversations, we had conversations with the Student Employment Office, with the HR, the Provost's office, to try to kind of come up with ways that make sense from an immigration point, but also from a university policy point. So based on both school decisions, like what the schools wanted to allow students to do, and the immigration, it ended up being the case at Yale that on-campus work from outside the US for students was allowed, but there were tricky cases like assistantships or stipends that were more tricky to navigate, and those we had to deal on a case-by-case basis. But if we're talking about a remote on-campus work that they would normally do here in the US and they have an active F1 status, we allowed those students to continue to engage in those. But it's been more challenging for scholars and employees, and thankfully Yale established an out-of-state work location committee, which actually slows pretty slowly, which is sometimes a good and sometimes a bad thing. So some of those approvals had to go through that committee, but again, we had to deal with the kind of what does it mean from an immigration point due to a J1 out of country and so on and so forth. So we kind of tried to find our ways, as we've been doing in the dark, and trying to come up with policies that made sense as much as possible.
Great, thank you. Andy, did you want to say anything?
Just very quickly, in the interest of time, I will just say that on the issues of remote employment and there were quite vigorous political discussions, and political meaning that everybody had different opinions and different interests, and reconciling those were quite challenging. So our role was just to advocate for students and scholars to make sure that where we could provide them with opportunities or maintain them in their opportunities, that we would try to support those. But in terms of the mechanics of paying them, taxing, et cetera, again, that was a little bit outside, that was outside of our domain, but again, that is something where we had vigorous policy, participated in vigorous policy discussions involving academic units and deans who wanted one outcome, payroll who wanted another outcome, HR, so on and so forth, as well as our global operations unit that normally handles international hiring and taxation for subcontractors and overseas employees. So lots of work in terms of actual implementation. Tufts did not do, the International Center was not directly involved in implementing those, but we were certainly participating in those discussions.
All right, great, thank you. So we'll just move on in the interest of time. We're pretty much done. So if you could go to the next slide, Andrea. Great. So now we did make it just to our 75-minute mark. So thank you. And we wanted to take questions now. We're available for the next 15 minutes or so. The upcoming sessions are posted on the Region 11 website, and I think Andrea posted that link. This week there's H-1B update and F1 basics. Don't forget to register for yourself, or you won't show up as yourself on the Zoom. And also look out for Ozon's super informative Wednesday emails, and thank you to him for that. Our contact information is there too, and we're happy to hear from you directly if you have any questions. And I'll turn it over to, if you want to ask a question and not in the chat, we're going to now show the whole group so we can see your faces if you're still there. And if you want to turn on your camera to ask a question or start a discussion, please feel free. You can also still put questions in the chat as well. And thank you so much for your attention on this rainy afternoon. And I'll turn it over to questions.
Yeah, I think we still have one outstanding question from chat, which is, how would people advise for scholars out of the country with out of the country who will not return before the end of their J1 with regard to remote employment versus HR making them a contractor at the end of their J1?
Hi, Andrea, can I answer this? So, I mean, we have a lot of, or not a lot, but we've definitely have had J1 scholars who've been outside the US for quite some time. And we've had to kind of try to separate the issue of their immigration status from whether or not they can be employed by the Institute. And MIT has been very, they have like pretty strict policies about how long somebody can be employed outside of the US. And it has a lot to do with like tax implications and that kind of thing. And, you know, in a lot of cases, if they're outside the US, they don't need a US immigration status. It's not, you're only in an immigration status if you're inside the US. And so in some cases, yeah, it has been a good decision to end their J so that they can, you know, start accruing their 24-month bar or whatever they need to do. But it's not something we could really tell HR to do or not do. It's kind of, I don't know, I feel like we have to do it on a case-by-case basis, and it's very nuanced. Sorry, that might not have been an answer, but that's our experience.
I think from my perspective, and I don't have a concrete case in my mind, but I would try to determine what you want from a J management perspective first. You know, is what would be advantageous, what would be more accurately reflective of the situation and I think there are advantages, as mentioned, Amanda mentioned, to shortening the J record. if that scholar no longer needs to maintain physical presence in the United States as a condition of carrying out their activities. And then if that is the preferred position from a status maintenance and record upkeep point of view, then perhaps linking in your partners at HR or payroll and outlining what those proposed actions, and it's really up to them, I think, to assess what the mechanisms for paying somebody in that situation, whether or not they want to continue on with whatever they've been doing, or that requires them to fundamentally alter their HR situation. It will likely be a dialogue, but I want to articulate first what I want to do with the J record and why I want to do that with the J record and why that's advantageous to the institution and to the exchange visitor.
Are there any more questions or comments? There were some comments in the chat. I think we're all kind of feeling that we're in this together. And I want to actually highlight there was an exchange with Mike, Andy, I think commented, a couple other people commented that the fact that we're now dealing with so much more than what is kind of the traditional scope of our practices is both a good testament to kind of the excellent work I think our offices have been doing, having good reputations, but with those good reputations sometimes comes more responsibility, people knocking your door for more help. And that's challenging, especially with the limited resources and limited staff that many of our offices have. Sometimes we can't meet that demand for help. So how to navigate that has been challenging. But I think, we can look at the positive side as well, that, our offices, our students and scholars look up to us, our colleagues look up to us to kind of try to help them through this challenging situation. And I think we've been all doing, 1,000% more than we normally used to do to kind of meet those expectations. But it's also important to kind of self-preserve and get through this with, mental health and not burn out. And that's been a real challenge as well. So I think, so thank you all for joining that discussion.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Hang in there.
All right, thank you all. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It looks like we lost Jody.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you so much for everything.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.